Hey everybody, this is Perch. This is like a pure comic question here, not about the business, not about who's messing up what, but actually, I love questions like this. I was reminded I don't get a lot of questions like this ever on this channel, and but it's very much a question that you would get in a store. So the question is a lot of people have come into the Authority, and they started reading that comic. It got very popular. It was one of Wildstorm's bigger hits. And now this is happening a bit again because we have the Authority movie that will come out somewhere in 2048, somewhere in there. I don't know. The casting for that is going to be an absolute mess. I fear. I hope not, but I think there's a decent chance that the casting is going to be a zoo with that movie. But the Authority is being made, so a lot of people are discovering it and reading it and everything else. And so the question I actually got this just out there with Twitter, was, hey, I know there's a connection. The question basically goes, I know there's a connection with Stormwatch. Should I read Stormwatch before I read the Authority? Or if I read the Authority and I liked it, should I kind of halt, reading my way through Authority and go back and read Stormwatch? So to kind of back up a little bit, Stormwatch did come before Authority. And it was one of those books that I think the feeling that you got as a retailer was that this was kind of a knockoff of Wildcats, and it didn't really have its own thing going. But when you actually, that's how it was initially marketed. But the comic did actually seek to do very different things, and it introduced a lot of cool concepts. And I think Stormwatch is underrated in the sense of it tends to it never got the big buzz of Authority. And it wasn't kind of the big launch title like Wildcats or Cyberforce or one of those titles from Image. So Stormwatch just kind of slipped a little bit through the cracks. The characters were interesting. I've mentioned this at one point to somebody in the shop of like, if you like Legion of Superheroes and you like kind of some of these different heroes and different things going on, Stormwatch kind of scratches a different kind of itch with characters. And it's an interesting book. I found it reasonably decent. I think that for people who like that book and that title, like that kind of style of storytelling, I think Stormwatch could be a pretty great series. But is it necessary to read the Authority? Is it necessary to do you need to basically read the Authority? Sorry, I messed all up. I got all confused. Every now and then, Texas is weird. In the it just how people drive around. People do the craziest, damnedest ass things on a constant basis in Texas, and so I every now and then somebody's just driving kind of randomly down the middle of the road. Not in the lanes. Just fuck it. They're just just driving. Why are they driving this way? Nobody knows. And that just happened. Somebody just came to, moseying down and completely took me off my game. Okay. Sorry for that. So back to the question. If you read the Authority, and like I said, a lot of people are, the Authority does stand on its own. It's not necessary to read Stormwatch. Yes, Midnighter and Apollo were introduced in Stormwatch. Ginny Sparks, a couple of the characters, you do have some elements, but I think the Authority really kind of carved out its own space really, really early and quick. And it did not, it doesn't require a lot of material going into it. It's one of those actually few books where if you just pick up the Authority and you read it and you haven't even read a lot of superhero comics, it will work for you. It can. You basically just have to kind of understand general concept of there's superheroes on this world. These superheroes want to take a more active role in kind of policing the earth and kind of what they do. And it's a good story around that. In many ways, I actually had a lot of readers who didn't like the Authority, people who were really into Youngblood or Cyberforce or Wildcats or Spawn or some of the other characters that in theory were part of this shared universe. They didn't like the Authority because the Authority, at several times there'd be a big planetary emergency and those other teams were nowhere to be found, and it just they weren't there, weren't referenced, weren't needed. It felt like it felt like all the other parts of the shared superhero universe actually created more damage than helped in a lot of ways. There are a couple different writers, of course. Warren Ellis did some work. Mark Miller did some work. There's a couple different pretty high-end writers. You also had Brian Hitch on there. You had Frank Quietly. You had Art Adams, who actually did, a rare arc of comics. So you had some pretty top-notch talent, both writing and art, on that book. There's a lot of good stuff that came out of the Authority, but it isn't necessary to read anything else to do it. Now, if you really enjoy it and you want to then kind of wander into some of the origins of it, I think that going from reading the full first volume of Authority, moving from there to to Stormwatch and kind of seeing some of the origins of some of these characters, I think can be interesting, and you can get some good stuff out of it. But largely, Stormwatch, if I'm criticizing it, it did have a couple elements where it tried to, for lack of a better word, reboot itself. Like, here's a new team, and this team is doing this thing, and I always felt like it never really took like they hoped it would. It always felt just a tiny bit awkward in how it was done. So I think that, I don't know. Like I said, I like Stormwatch. I think it was a good book, but for me, The Authority was far better of a title. And I think The Authority asked big questions. But I guess the thing that I want to ask for you in the comments is, if you've read both these stories, which did you like better, Authority or Stormwatch? And in particular, what do you think about this concept that The Authority almost works better in its own universe? There was a storyline, this one that Art Adams did kind of very late in the run, where the government basically comes in and replaces the Authority. They enslaves them, kind of divides them up, gets them knocked down, and there's a new Authority that more or less are trying to go out and do things that are more government friendly, and instead of standing up for the people, stand up for the status quo. And that arc to me always felt like kind of the end of the series. In many ways, it was actually the end of the series. But that arc, it felt like it didn't sit right with me. And I'm curious if you really enjoyed The Authority, going through the Ginny Sparks stuff, going through the China storyline, going through, actually, I think there's a proxy country being used other than China, but going through the Doctor. There's a couple really incredible arcs that happened with The Authority. That one always felt, even though I loved Art Adams' art with it, it always felt weaker. It felt like that one felt more like Stormwatch, or more like the concept that kind of jumped the shark in itself. The storyline with the Doctor was always one of my favorites, because they took a villain, and it was Mark Miller wrote that one. If you remember, he basically kind of went all in on creating the most despicable, threatening, awful villain of all time. This villain had, crazy powers, could warp reality, bend time and space, everything else, and was absolutely immoral. And at one point, one of the heroes is kind of taking it to him and getting him on the defensive, and he just steps back in time and molests her as a kid. And then, comes back, and the hero is instantly traumatized. And it's like some of the most despicable, awful shit in this thing. But it really was, it was a villain. It was a true god-awful villain. And there was something, wonderful and miraculous about that in comics. Not the acts, obviously, what the villain was doing was abhorrent, but The Authority, when it was really clicking and doing things well, it gave a fairly unflinching look at how some of these things would be if it was real life, if there was actual, completely the worst villain in the world. I mean, unfortunately, if you read a book like that, you read some of the stuff that goes down in The Authority, it sort of ruins things like, Doctor Doom and the Red Skull and the Joker. I mean, can you really look at the Joker as a deeply psychotic, threatening villain after that? I mean, sure, you can a bit, but I mean, because the Joker's still murdering people, doing bad things, but it's like, you're nowhere close to the kind of villainy that, was put out in The Authority. But regardless, I recommend if you haven't read The Authority, I recommend you go read it. It's a good book. Wildstorm, you can find it fairly easily. There's trades out there. There's a number of different ways it's been collected. It's a fun read. It is definitely that deconstruction of superheroes that you either love or you hate. But this is them doing it well. I think if you're gonna deconstruct and you're gonna play that angle, then do it masterfully. And I think this comic does do a very good job of it. And then I guess the other question to you: what do you think? Is Stormwatch required reading? Do you need to read Stormwatch to appreciate The Authority? Curious if somebody really disagrees. I'd love to hear your take on it. But anyway, fun little thing to talk about. What comics are needed to enjoy other comics. Anyway, let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and thanks for listening.